Welcome. This is the Psychology of Black Womanhood podcast, where we're centering research in real-world conversations. I'm Dr. Dion Stevens, your host, co-author of the Psychology of Black Womanhood book, and a professor of psychology. I'm excited to have you with us, so let's get into today's episode. Black women are one of the most educated and fastest growing segments of the U.S. workforce, yet we continue to face some of the most persistent challenges on the job market. We're sitting down with Dr. NiCole T. Buchanan to unpack the complex realities Black women face in today's workplace, from layoffs to return to office mandates to shifting workplace policies and leadership practices. Dr. Buchanan draws upon her decades of research examining how systematic inequalities continue to shape career opportunities and well-being of Black women. Dr. Buchanan is a professor of psychology at Michigan State University, a fellow of the Association for Psychological Science, and a fellow in 4 divisions of the American Psychological Association. Dr. Buchanan researches the interplay of race, gender, and victimization, and how these impact the nature of sexual and racial harassment, both on Black women and organizational best practices. I want to dive right in because I think we already know what's going on with Black women, specifically in the workplace. So this might be a loaded question to get us going, but if you could change one thing immediately about the workplace culture in America, what would it be?
Yeah, that's a great starting place. One of the things I would like to see is a little more humility from those in charge. Some sense that they may not actually know all there is to know, and that the people that are working for them have something to contribute, both in the actual substance of the work, but also interpersonally. And that what often people of color, women of color, are bringing to their attention that they don't see and they don't believe exists, that it could have a grain of truth, and they could spend some time listening to it and investigating its truth.
That's an interesting place to start. And I think it makes sense when we hear all this stuff that's going on. How have these layoffs and return to office mandates and all this corporate restructuring disproportionately keep affecting Black women?
Well, we can see that virtually any time there are major changes in how the workforce is organized, it often comes at the expense of the most marginalized among us. So people of color, then women of color, we can anticipate that it's going to be borne on our backs. And as we look at this particular time, we're in a new and uniquely horrifying space, because now we have federal prohibitions against our very existence in the workplace, and a questioning that if we are even visible, it must be because we have been instituted through some special program and we don't belong and we are not qualified. And we're seeing mass layoffs, chronic unemployment among women of color, in particular, Black women, Black men. And it's not that we haven't been here before, but I think many of us, especially if you did the quote unquote right things and you got an education, or you had a great work record and you worked really hard and you had great reviews, we thought we were protected from some of these horrors. And this wave feels different to many of us, because unless you're, a couple years older than me, you probably lived in a period of time where it was steady improvement. And there was this ability to realize what we've called the American dream. And it became easy to envision a future of retirement and achievement and acceptance for your expertise. And again, what we've seen is that if the federal government has decided to target you as a group, you will experience that pain and suffering pretty quickly and pretty comprehensively.
This is having impacts even in corporate private sector, correct?
Yes. One of the things that I've been humbled by is how comprehensive it can be, how you get tax breaks, how you are applying for federal contracts. There are all of these ways in which the role of the federal government has not been front and center in our lives.
Right.
And once the government took off the guardrails in basic civility at the workplace, and once they started instituting things like you can't demonstrate equity policies at work if you want to work with the federal government. So you're seeing not only that their policies end up hitting private and corporate sectors in ways that many of us weren't aware of, but we also see that when the federal government removes those expectations, some of the worst impulses of individuals come to the surface. And you start to see that people that normally would have held themselves in check, they would have focused on making sure they were engaging in an equitable practice. Their base instincts come to play, their implicit biases come to play. So I'm going to hire my friend because, of course, my friend is qualified instead of having an open search. I'm going to get rid of that person that keeps bringing up these touchy race and gender issues that makes me uncomfortable because there's no federal prohibition against wanton firings. And so we're seeing these impacts spread far and wide beyond just the federal government.
Can you discuss a little bit more about these types of workplace microaggressions and specifically how they show up differently for Black women as compared to even Black men or white women in professional spaces?
Yes, this is one of the areas where I began my career, is looking at sexualized racial harassment. And that's the way in which a person might have sexual overtones in the way they're being mistreated and also racial overtones in the way that they're being mistreated. And that based on our identities, it uniquely fuses into something that looks a little bit different. Right. And so despite the fact that sexual harassment case law was all born on the backs of Black women who were able to bring their cases forward because there were racial components, once it got set into law and once it began being researched heavily, we saw it was almost exclusively focused on the kinds of experiences white women have. And the experiences that Latina women have, that Asian women have, that Black women have, they were largely ignored.
Right.
When I came into doing this work, one of the things that was obvious to me is while the general definitions of harassment and mistreatment at work, they applied to Black women, but there was this whole category of things that weren't being adequately captured. Things around hypersexualization of certain body parts that might be expected to look differently for Black women. When I was interviewing women, there were lots of these comments they would get at work about their butts, about their behinds, and these real sexualized, ugly ways that they saw maybe something would be said to one of their white coworkers, but the way it was targeting them was based on these stereotypes of them specifically as Black women. And in ways that wouldn't apply to other women and also wouldn't apply to Black men, they were specific to them. Of course, we're seeing as there's initiations to bring forth the Crown Act in different parts of the country, the way Black women's hair has been at times criminalized, relegated as unprofessional, be forced to conform to appearances and looks that is not natural for our hair. These are other ways in which it may not be sexualized in the way we tend to think about sexual harassment, but it is a gender-based harassment that's specific to racialized women. And that if you can't conform to the standard that typically is set by the way white women might appear in the workplace, then you're deemed unprofessional and unacceptable in that workplace.
I'm also thinking about this stereotype that people talk a lot about now, and I know we're discussing it, particularly among Black women academics, is this stereotype of the strong Black woman and negotiating this boundary between assertiveness and being labeled aggressive. Does that come up in your research in any way?
That is exactly one of the things that women brought up regularly. And it's interesting because often it was coming up in these ways, in these everyday ways. Right. Just the way that they carried themselves might be perceived as either so confident and assertive, but also with that flair of a little bit on the aggressive, and the word that was often used is intimidating. People are intimidated by you because you will say the hard thing, because you will approach something with full confidence that the way you're talking about this is correct. And it would trigger the insecurities in some of their coworkers. And so just their way of being was connected to this idea of Black female strength in a way that for some felt empowering, but ultimately stereotypes served to disempower.
Right.
The other way this was sometimes seen as a strength, sometimes seen as a challenge, was that if the hard things needed to be said, it was often left to Black women to be the ones to say the hard thing, which can be a sign of leadership and strength. But of course, if the things that you're bringing up are things that people make others uncomfortable, then often what happens is ultimately they're socially shunned.
Yeah.
And they are not being brought in for leadership because they may not be seen as warm and competent as people typically might expect of someone in leadership. There's also some interesting research, it's a little bit of an aside, but some interesting research on when are Black women brought in for leadership positions. Yeah. And what we see is they're brought in at this point where a company is already failing.
Yeah.
And the idea of Black women as these contradictory stereotypes. So they're strong, they are able to push forward and push through any obstacles. And they also have this warmth. They can be everybody's mom and do all the things for all the people. And so they're put in charge of these organizations that are really struggling and at their brink of failure, based on these stereotypes of the way Black women might be as far as nurturing and strong and pushing forward. And that also means that they're often set up to be in charge when something actually does fail. And then when they do turn it around, then people swoop back in and put the typical types of leadership people back in charge. So there's this catch-22 that Black women often find themselves when it comes to leadership roles that do harken back to stereotypes about them both as mammy and as a strong Black woman.
It sounds like there's a lot of self-monitoring going on. And I know you talked a little bit in your research too about this code switching. It takes a lot of emotional labor to do this. What were some of your findings around how Black women were coping and navigating these tensions?
Well, not only my work, but there are others that find some of this as well, that there is a near constant set of dual consciousness about what is it I need to say? How am I going to say it? How am I going to make sure that it is hearable for my audience, yet consistent with my truth and with the authenticity of what needs to be communicated? And so there's this complex interplay that Black women are constantly engaging in. Now, many of the women that are successful, they talk about they've been doing this game so much of their life that it's almost second nature. But what we know is those constant cognitive shifts, that constant self-monitoring as you're trying to engage, these things come at a cost. They come at a cost for your psychological well-being, your ability to make the cognitive switches in other domains and the cognitive resources you can bring to a task, your physical well-being. They all suffer when we have to engage in this constant self-monitoring and this constant performance to make sure that what we're saying is true and acceptable to the people that need to hear our messages.
What are you seeing there are the outcomes at the individual level in terms of how Black women are able to cope and even their emotional well-being around this?
Even if I look at some of my colleagues who by most definitions have done very well, they will often say that this has come at a significant cost to their emotional well-being, sometimes to their important relationships, sometimes to their physical health. I think often the physical health consequences are down the road a bit and may not be as obvious. And when people are in good times, these constant struggles may not be as obvious, but at the slightest downturn, it often will show up and will be considerable. Maybe moving from having some intermittent feelings of depression to once these things start to shift and your environment starts to crack, that depression becomes really significant. Or the coping strategies people are using to make it through every day are no longer working effectively. We might see people overindulging in things that help with the momentary coping, but may have longer term consequences for their well-being. And also very often not feeling like they have places to turn where they can be vulnerable and talk about the challenges they're having, whether this is being reluctant to go to the employee assistant program because these are ultimately therapy sessions, but they're with your employee, to seeking therapy in the community, and there being so few Black women who they can turn to. And often those women those therapists are already overbooked because there's so few of them and so many people seeking that care. So there often is a dearth of options for people and where they can go when they do want to seek well-being and care.
I think it's really important. We're talking here a lot, like you said, about the importance of Black women supporting each other. And we're seeing a lot of that happening in terms of there's a lot of movements online with Black women making groups to help support each other emotionally, but also professionally, like connecting with jobs and opportunities. But one thing that we talk less about are ways in which these types of efforts to support each other are disrupted by the institutions. Can you dive a little bit into the dynamic, which I know your work touches on, where Black women are sometimes pitted against each other in the workplace?
There are certainly environments where there might only be 2 or 3 and they're pitted against one another, or there's this subtle or not so subtle way in which it's communicated to them that it's only going to be 1 or 2 of you that make it. So for audience members that are unfamiliar with tenure, this is typically 6 to 7 years into a faculty member's career, where they have to demonstrate that they have enough perhaps grants or publications or whatever those items are in their field for the university to say you are an accomplished enough scholar that we will roll the dice and take a chance on you, and we will commit to you being employed here through the rest of your career. And tenure is going away at a lot of places, but it's kind of the rung that people in academia seek to achieve, because that's the point where you have job stability. And I've heard stories frequently in my own experience where there were 2 or 3 of us there, and I was being told, don't work with her because if you work with her, she'll bring you down. And later found out she was being told, well, don't work with NiCole because if you work with NiCole, she'll bring you down. So we were being pit against one another and being framed as enemies to one another. And thankfully, we had the good sense to talk to one another anyway. I should be clear. These were not people who overlapped in those committees. So my review committee was a different set of people from hers. And yet we were both being told that the other person was going to be a problem. Don't connect to them.
Right.
And I see these kinds of examples anecdotally all the time, where your most natural ally might be the person who has similar interests, doing similar work, has similar populations, and could be a source of connections and collaboration. And instead of that being encouraged, they're being pitted against one another. So yes, that absolutely happens. And in a world where you're being hyper surveilled, it can be very difficult to decide you're going to rise above that and make that connection anyway. Because, of course, there's always a price to be paid when people perceive you as not following their advice.
What are you finding across generations with Black women and how they're thinking about work?
Borrowing from the research I've seen other people do and looking at some of the generational trends, some of what we're seeing with younger generations is a distinct shift in the degree to which they feel hopeless about the future, the way in which they interpret themselves as having any agency. And we're seeing this in all sorts of ways. Younger generations deciding that maybe they won't have children, or maybe they'll have far fewer children because they don't see themselves as having control and agency over the way their lives are going to go, or the way the future is going to pan out. And their ability to have a family, have a successful relationship, and have a successful career feels very much like it's in flux and out of their control, which means people are going to start restricting the choices that they do have, like, do I have more children or have children at all? I'm also seeing differences in the perspective people have on their ability to save for a future and save for a retirement. So when I went to the workforce, I remember my mom talking to me about the very first thing you need to do is start retiring from the very beginning, and you'll have so much more money if you do so. And Mom, I listened. That was one of the one pieces of information I listened to. So I did that. And I had the sense of I'm building for a possibility of a time where I won't need to work so intensely, that I will develop a nest egg and it will sustain me so that I can have another phase of life. And when I'm talking to younger people, many don't feel there's a need to save because they don't have that same sense of a future. They don't see a time where they'll be able to step out of the rat race. Often, many of them don't see them ever having enough money where they could retire, or they see themselves as so strapped now where their money doesn't go far enough to meet their basic needs, even if they're making a fair amount of money. Right. And so the possibility of saving seems really out of touch for them. Mm-hmm. And where some of what I fear is, how is that going to translate for these generations 10, 20, 30 years down the road? Will we see a point where society has turned in such a way where they can begin to feel hopefulness? Personally, I don't know. Is there a phase where your upbringing has so been defined by chaos and insecurity that it's very difficult to ever right that ship again? As I look at even our college students now, a significant part of their education was under COVID.
Right.
If you go back a little further, or they may have seen their parents who were wiped out in 2008 with the recession, and then COVID hit, and now we're in this another financially very precarious place. It becomes really hard to convince people that if they do the work and they put in the time, they're going to have the successes. And so what does that start to look like when you have a generation of people where many of them believe that they won't have a chance, and that if they start to get on their feet, it's going to be wiped out from under them once again?
So what would you say to a Black woman who is questioning her value and who her allies are in the workplace based on what you found in your research?
One of the elements that was really effective for a lot of the women in our various studies was seeking mentorship, but seeking mentorship at multiple levels. You might have a mentor in your unit, but also making sure that you have mentorship at multiple other levels. So in the university context, you might have somebody in your department, but also seeking somebody else in your university, that person who can give you information, give you context, give you feedback, but they're not directly involved in your evaluations.
Right.
So, but then also having mentorship at a national level. This might be through societies and organizations that are aligned with your particular field. And in these spaces, you might have people that can put you in touch with other people that might be able to be letter writers, who might be able to be key in connecting you to other resources and other organizations that may even begin to encourage you for job opportunities elsewhere. And those multi-level mentoring relationships, some that are within your unit, but also outside, so you can get different perspectives from people who are in vastly different workplaces, often what is really critical to gaining the kind of perspective you need to appropriately weigh what's happening in your given department or in your unit with what your possibilities are in the outside world.
So I appreciate all these individual level suggestions that you're giving that are clearly based in the research, but I'm also thinking a lot of it will depend on our workplace culture and how it supports or doesn't support Black women. What does a thriving workplace look like for Black women?
That's a great question. If I try to envision what could be one of the things that we see is that there is diversity at all levels of leadership. That you can look up and see people like you, that you can aspire to fill those roles. You can, and that there are sufficient number of people in these various roles that you have an opportunity for mentorship. You have an opportunity to be guided. And even if you don't happen to click with that one person, there are other people in that workplace that you can connect to. We have to also look at what are the systems and policies and practices of that organization. If you have people there, but the people there are still serving white supremacy culture, or they are not countering creating equitable spaces, or they're allowing bad behaviors to continue, maybe even subtly encouraging those bad behaviors, then in some ways it won't matter all that much if there are other people like you at higher levels, because the organization itself is rotten. The organization itself is allowing these kind of behaviors. As a general rule, I always look at leadership. What is leadership doing to set the tone for how people should be engaging one another, for how equity should be infused within all the practices? How are we holding ourselves accountable for these metrics? And are people actually being held accountable and rewarded based on those values. And when you see an environment where everybody will have, we're the equal opportunity employer, everybody has those words, but we can clearly see they're enacted very differently in different spaces. Mm-hmm. So it has to go beyond the words on paper. It has to be enacted and lived out in everyday practice. And often that means it's coming from the highest steps of leadership and going all the way down where it's not only stated as a value, but it's lived as a practice. And there's accountability around those behaviors and those practices.
I like that you talked about this because when you think about it, and I'm even thinking everything is metrics, which you talked about earlier, which is sort of the check-off accountability. And that might be one of the easier points where we can say, well, this is what we're told, the line that we're supposed to move. What are some of the metrics that companies might want to think about or that we should be looking for to determine whether Black women are actually advancing and feeling supported?
One of the things I think can be really useful, but also are often not done well or not really utilized, are looking at climate studies. You can do some metrics. You can look at the numbers and say, oh, there are people progressing in this unit. And maybe you are seeing that Black women do go through ranks and they progress. But are they progressing because of the policies and practices or in spite of the policies and practices? When they get to these positions, are they living lives that other people look at and they want to aspire to? Or are they miserable, working themselves to death, becoming a version of themselves that they don't even like? Are they able to live in wellness and have other key important relationships? Or are they working nonstop just to be pleasing enough or successful enough or productive enough to stay in the good graces of the leadership of their organization? So climate studies are often where you're going to get some of those more difficult to count pieces of information. You're going to find out that people don't trust one another or they don't trust leadership, that they have had experiences that maybe they don't know if it fits the anti-discrimination policy, but it certainly makes them feel unwanted in that workplace. And a lot of the measures that organizations use are really biased to get them the kind of data they want to see. But if you really want to know, where are the cracks in our foundation? Where are the problematic departments? Where are the stages in their promotions where they don't feel valued? The organizations that are willing to take those things seriously, that really are focusing on creating a positive climate. And when I say this, I mean for everyone. And if you center creating a positive climate for the individuals who experience the most marginalization, it's Black women, then you are going to create an environment where everyone there is able to thrive. And that is the piece that a lot of organizations miss. They are seeking to please the ones that are already successful in these organizations or the people who they have a sense of what they want and need. But if they refocus on those individuals who are experiencing marginalization and they make sure that they can thrive, that they can feel welcome and wanted, then it applies to everybody in the organization and everyone is doing better. What we know is this improves the bottom line, whatever your bottom line is. If you're about teaching students, you find that people are teaching better and students are learning more. Students are learning how to think in more complex ways. If you are in sales, you see that your sales improve, that the bottom line improves there. If you are in innovation, you see that these teams will come up with better ideas that have global impact. So across the board, these are diverse teams and diverse workplaces where they've centered making everyone feel welcome, wanted, and as an active contributor. Those are the spaces where they really rise in ranks and they are incredibly successful overall.
I think it's so powerful that you brought up that even though we're here talking about it in terms of Black women, making these changes benefit everyone. There's so much research supporting it, but it even logically makes sense. Why do you think there's still resistance to people hearing this?
The resistance to hearing this comes from a few directions. First, I'll just put out there that most of the way we are structured is based on white supremacy culture. And there's very interesting work on white supremacy culture, specifically in organizations, and how that manifests and how that looks. And the reality is many people in leadership are comfortable with the way organizations function without recognizing how those links actually serve to suppress the agency of some of their employees and amplify that of others. Right. And so when the people in power are comfortable with these structures, they're not going to do the hard work to create the changes. They may not even see that those changes are necessary. Right. We are also, specifically in this time, we are in a time and space where, again, we talked about where our very government is saying that if you have people who look different from our standard, then they are by default they do not belong, they did not earn it, and they are not contributing. And that gives us free license to ignore a lot of the feedback that says people are unhappy, to get rid of people if there are any challenges whatsoever, even if those challenges are the result of the workplace culture that we've created. Right. So it becomes very easy to justify throwing people away instead of making the kind of changes that makes things better. And the other thing is often these changes are uncomfortable. Yeah. They are very uncomfortable, especially if you're having to learn to engage in a way that is not historically resonant for you. And we have this other factor that not only bias, it's not all bias against one group. It's sometimes even more powerful is our favoritism towards our own group. Yeah. So being able to look at this new person applying for a job and you're like, they remind me just of myself when I was new in this company. And so we have this desire to mentor them and to work with them and to help them. And we don't even realize all the little subtle things that we may be doing that create a different trajectory for that person compared to someone else in their cohort who we don't have that in-group favoritism for. Right. So we have to not only begin to focus on where we have differences and how those differences create trajectories that take people in different directions, but we also need to focus on how we have those that we just seem to like a little bit more because they are similar to us, and how we subtly create opportunities for them that are by definition denied to others.
I know a lot of your work, and where I became familiar was through your work around academics and exclusion. But you've done a little bit more work that ties it to broader society. Can you kind of expand on that and share what some of your findings are?
Sure. I work with a team, and we are looking at a concept called epistemic exclusion, which is a fancy way of talking about knowledge that is produced by a particular kind of scholars, typically marginalized scholars, whether you're queer faculty or you're faculty of color, that the things that we're interested in, the topics that we're studying, the populations we're studying, are typically excluded from mainstream research. And that exclusion is not random, and it makes this journey we're on to have our research respected, picked up, utilized, and impactful, makes it that much more difficult. Yeah. And although this epistemic exclusion is often talked about in the academic sphere, what we are seeing at this point, largely anecdotal, but we are going to be moving the studies into other sectors, is anywhere where you have, it's more that these thinkers, these ways of knowing information and the way of thinking through the material and the types of projects and ideas that are valued are informed by our situation and where we are seated in life. And so our past experiences inform our knowledge base and our interest base. Yeah. And so whether you're an attorney or whether you are working in innovation, that when we are looking and we are in these different fields and we're trying to offer what we have to contribute, and we're offering our perspective and we're offering new ideas, that those individuals are also experiencing epistemic exclusion, where their thoughts, their ways of thinking, and the things that they value are being systematically excluded and devalued. Yeah. And we have to start thinking about, as a society, at what cost are we excluding the perspective, the ways of thinking, and the values of vast swaths of our communities? What is costing the organization we're in? What is costing the fields that we represent? And what is the cost to society as a whole?
This is such a timely discussion, and it's interesting when everybody talks, they're trying to figure out, especially as Black women, what we're going to be doing next and how we're going to get through and how we're going to hold fast to whatever we do have. What gives you hope when you think about the future of Black women in the workforce?
One, I listen to a lot of podcasts that are focused on these issues, and that's not always a source of hope. It's sometimes a bit depressing, but it does connect me with the idea that I'm not alone. That the experiences I'm having or the people around me I'm having, that this is a collective experience that many throughout our nation are in right now. It also keeps me connected to the structural conditions that are leading to this, because especially if you may be a little more vulnerable to self-doubt, when you're in these experiences where people are pinpointing you as defective, it may be easier to take that in as legitimate and not question the system. So staying connected to the podcasts and videos and the political commenters who remind us that it is not personal, even though we are personally impacted.
Yeah.
And that piece is important. I also remain hopeful. Again, this isn't necessarily a cheery way, but I remain hopeful by focusing on what our previous generations, what our ancestors had to go through, and recognizing that we have hit these times in the past. We went through Reconstruction. We went through the Civil Rights era. We have gone through these fights. We will always have these experiences where the sudden and often violent pushback, and yet we have consistently come forward, moved forward, and pushed farther. I remind myself that I am my ancestors' wildest dream, that I have done more than they ever hoped for their lineage, and I am committed to pushing that forward. But we've been here before. It's looked a little bit different, but we have been through times that felt insurmountable, and as a community, we have persevered and we have pushed further and further along through each of these iterations.
We were just listening to Dr. NiCole T. Buchanan discussing her research focusing on the experiences of Black women in the workplace today. For more details about her research, her writing, and where to follow her online, check out this episode page on the Psychology of Black Womanhood website. Thanks so much for joining us for this episode of the Psychology of Black Womanhood podcast. We're really glad you're part of this growing community where we're centering research and real-world conversations to reflect the lived experiences of Black women. If you've been enjoying this podcast, we'd love for you to show your support by leaving a review, following us on Instagram or Facebook, and sharing these episodes with your own community. And don't forget to pick up a copy of the book that inspired this all, The Psychology of Black Womanhood. It's a powerful resource for anyone wanting to dig deeper into these themes. Until next time, keep it real, keep it thoughtful, and keep uplifting Black women through research and reflection.